Good evening, it's great to be here. My name is Ishai Smaja. I'm a product manager with King's Experimentation Group. Our experimentation group is the team that's in charge of innovation, finding new opportunities, and kind of pushing the envelope, questioning the norms. For those of you who don't know, King is a mobile games developer. We have some very popular titles like Candy Crush, Farm Heroes that's made here in London, and Pet Rescue. We have over 200 million monthly users and a lot of games. So we have a lot of data. We have a lot of different products around that we're trying to learn and cross-learn. A bit about my background before I get into the topic of this talk. I started out 4 years in military intelligence that obviously I can't say much about. Then I made the switch to management consulting. I had 3 years as a management consultant. I worked with a lot of companies, and I think there's lots of parallels between management consulting and product management. So a lot of it is tackling big problems, and which is part of the role of a product manager. So whether you're starting out a new product, whether you're founding your own company, or you're working on getting new features out there, you're often fronted with a big issue that's hard to wrap your head around. And a lot of it is breaking it down in a systematic sort of way. Today, I'm going to talk about the different stages of product development that apply to game development as well. So as you can see, there's opportunity, solution, and validation, and implementation. And I'm not going to touch on implementation. Implementation is a lot of the Scrum, the Kanban, the actual work being done that I'm sure you've had a lot of trainings about, you've read a lot about. And what I'd rather do is touch those first three things. All right? So the idea is that knowing these stages, thinking about them methodologically and analytically is the role of a product manager, whether it's with new feature development, new product development, or just optimizing. And let's start with opportunity. So what is an opportunity? The way I like to think about opportunity and opportunity identification is identifying need. So needs could be figuring out a new feature, or a new game out there, creating a new genre, or just finding a solution for a problem. So we start out with needs. Needs are things that customers would like. So let's take an example that's very different than the universe of gaming or even most tech products. Let's say you have an ice cream shop. Your customers would like to get the ice cream from where it's stored to their mouths in some way. And you have different solutions. So solutions could be you can give it to them in a cone or in a cup, or you could build an ice cream catapult and just shoot it into their mouths. Or if the technology existed, you could have teleported it into their mouths. So what is an opportunity? An opportunity is a match between a need and a solution. There are different ways to do different things. But a winning opportunity is one that's creating value for the customers and is delivered to them. So for example, catapulting ice cream into customers' mouth doesn't necessarily create value for them. But if somebody was to invent a drip-free cone to protect your children from getting all messy when they eat their ice cream, that would create value. And saying that it has to be delivered. So you can come up with a great idea, but if you can't actually create it or bring it to the customers, it doesn't bring them a lot of value. The first thing I want to touch on is how do you come up with opportunities? How do you find them? And there are several ways that are called systematic creativity. Let's start with an example of Uber. And what we do is we break different products into the need and the solution. So if we look at Uber, the need that it answers is transportation. And the solution it finds is a marketplace for rides. But we have different solutions for the transportation issue. TfL, which isn't the best solution at the time. I experienced a problem with the black line on my way here. You can get communal cars, communal bikes. And when you think about marketplace, you get marketplace for food, marketplace for accommodation, marketplace for tasks, and so on. So what do we need to do is we break innovations down to need and solution, and we look for alternate solutions for the need or alternate needs for the solution. In my area, I would wonder, what does Netflix for games look like? That's a very interesting concept. Subscription, how it could work. It's something a lot of gaming companies are looking at. When we apply it to games, so this is Candy Crush, one of King's most successful games. And the game is basically comprised of what we deliver people, which is the switcher puzzle. The core of the game is the minute-to-minute gameplay. And we wrap it around with a meta layer, which is the map progression, but same here. So different games take the same core switcher puzzle and deliver it in a way of designing your aquarium, building a house, or even an action RPG. Whilst you can use the same envelope to create with different types of puzzles. So another way of systematic creativity is just to think about annoyances, things that really, really bother you, and make sure that they don't bother just you. They have to be universal, so problems that a lot of people deal with and are vexed by. Then think about how new technologies could help solve those things. For example, if my kids were to want a pet and to have a dog, and eventually I'd have to walk the dog every morning, that's a big problem for me. So obviously, like, we don't have dog walking robots yet, but a dog walking drone is an interesting application of a drone. Another thing is to look at trend-based innovation. So look at what's happening in different demographics. Think about microeconomics, macroeconomics, and import innovation from different places. Often we see that companies in the East are adopting things that happen in the West and vice versa. So if you look at, let's say, China, now they have a lot of advancement in payments and micropayments and getting things, skipping phases that we had here in the West, like credit cards, and those things would come here. So we can look what's happening elsewhere and import it here. And it works also in the gaming. So how many of you are familiar with the concept of a gacha chest? Right. So in a lot of games, you have mystery boxes. If you were playing games, you earn some currency, you open a mystery box, and you get some cards, you get some boosters, so on. And this is a concept that was imported from Asian RPGs. And now it's very common in games in the West and in the East across all the spectrum. So to break it down, what is systematic creativity? First, we abstract things into patterns. We see what's happening. We can think about it as what annoys me, what this technology can achieve. We can break it down by solution and need and try to think about how this solution can be applied elsewhere, or how can we also answer the need elsewhere. We understand the why, when, and where. Why is this working? How is this working? And finally, we translate it into other contexts. Now, some of the examples I gave here were quite silly, and that's intentional. When you're thinking about the opportunity, you shouldn't limit yourself at this point. You should have as many ideas as possible. The more the merrier. Don't bother if they're too simple, too obvious, or just don't even make sense. Just get them out there. Start with a list of 1,000 ideas. If I ask somebody to come up with one idea, they'll try to come up with their best idea. But if I'm going to tell you come up with 1,000 ideas, you're just going to throw it out there. It's Uber for plants, it's Uber for shoes, and so on. And this way of systematic creativity, you're going to think about things you wouldn't have necessarily thought of initially, and you're going to be able to pivot. So after opportunity comes the part of the solution. But before I go there, anyone has any questions about opportunity generation or comments about different methods? Yes?
What's the proportion between copying something existing and really inventing your experience?
I think that's an interesting question. I think a lot of new things you see out there are iterative processes. So King, before it created Candy Crush, we had a portal, a web portal, long before the rise of mobile, and there were over 200 titles there. So it's not that those ideas come one day. A lot of things come through pivoting. Can circle the question back to you, what is new? So let's think about a product like a taxi app or a cab hailing app. The problem was here, taxi drivers have to have something called the knowledge. So they have to know all the streets in London by heart, which is obviously a big barrier for entry. So today it seems simple to solve it with GPS and with different apps, right? But even before that, at some point in London, somebody came up with the ideas of having cabs where the drivers don't know where they're going. And this is a perfect product for people that want to tell the cab drivers where to go because they know what the best way is. So nothing is, in my perspective, nothing is actually new. It's all iterations of something else, and it's all building on something else. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. Any more questions about opportunity generation before I go forward? Yes?
Yeah, so let's say you're working on a product. So isn't it hard to think out of the box and think even small improvements? It's hard to think because you have a product in front of you, and then you have to think of modifications, reinventions. How do you go about that?
Yes, it's super hard. This is why you shouldn't try and think about one thing. You shouldn't find the best solution. Or you shouldn't even think about the top 10 best solutions. Just write everything. Don't matter how silly it sounds. Look at what other apps are doing, what other places in the industry are doing. Sometimes just let it simmer for a while, don't deal with it, do something else. Just get as many ideas out there as you can. Don't try to rule them out. You wake up in the middle of the night, you had a weird dream about the problem you're trying to solve, write it down. Think about it later. I think Mark Twain once said, write a drunk, edit sober, and that's what you should do. When you're generating the ideas, just have as many as you can, and then try to narrow them down and think them through methodologically. So as we said, at this point, you should have loads of ideas. Some of them don't make sense. But you want to do something that can be delivered and creates value. At this point, when we think about creating value to the customer, what we need to think about is who is the customer. And we can think about them, the customers, as the market, the people who are currently using a very similar market, let's say beer, so people who drink BrewDog beer, right? Then you have your soon-to-be non-customers. So these are people who are drinking other types of beers. Then you have the refusing non-customers. So these would be wine drinkers. So they drink products that are substitutional, but they don't consume your product. And finally, you have the unexplored non-customers. So people who don't drink alcohol at all for different reasons. So I'll try and apply this framework with a concrete example that's close to my heart. So if we think about video games back in 2006, before the rise of mobile, you had your video game market, which was largely people who played game on consoles and PC. Those games tend to be more hardcore. Then you get marginal gamers. So these are the people that would enjoy the occasional game at their friend's house or when they go into a shop or an arcade. But they don't actually own a console. Then you have people who play Sudoku or crossword. So they're playing games, but not really what we would call video games. And finally, you have the elderly people and moms who would never even play a video game of any sort. And what I'd like to do is to try and suggest a framework, and there's a lot of them, to think how you generate value to those customers. How do you create your unique value proposition? And how do you capture the value? So what we do, we use something called the ERRC matrix, which is a method of looking at value proposition. What it means is we look at what elements of the product we eliminate, what elements we raise, we give the customers more of, what elements we reduce, and what do we create? Where do we innovate if we're creating a blue ocean opportunity, so something totally new? And let's try and have a look together how this applies to mobile games compared to console games or PC games. So when I'm looking at what we can eliminate, we get the price point, which with mobile is basically 0. So most games are free to play or have a very low price points compared to what it would cost you to get a PlayStation and then a PlayStation game. You don't have to have a bespoke unit to play mobile games. And the control complexity is much lower. So you have so it's easier, you don't have to have a remote, you just use it with your fingers, it's much more intuitive. Then things that were reduced. So a slower learning curve, the games tend to be simpler. At recent trends, we see that they're getting more complex, and that's an interesting topic, but learning curve is usually simpler with mobile games. Then you get not as good graphics, which are not so important to people who play games on mobile. They do it for different reasons. What you raise is the variety of games. There are over 700,000 games in the app stores today, which is much, much more than you've had 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. When I played on the first console I had, there were 600 games in total. That was the universe. And virality, it's much easier to distribute mobile games. There are a lot less barriers. And finally, the value that was created is family-friendly games and bite-sized entertainment. You don't really go for a session of Call of Duty for 5 minutes, but you would sit down and play Candy Crush for 5 minutes on your commute. You can take it around with you and have it at different times during the day. We apply the same thing when we're looking at our own games or at our own market, so you can apply it in different ways. So what we see here is an audience profile for players of puzzle games. So puzzle games would be games like Candy Crush or Bubble Witch, and games appeal to different player motivations, so players care about different things. And what we see here in the dotted line is the needs of those players, and what you see with the area chart is the satisfied needs. And where you see gaps is where you see opportunities. So obviously the games, puzzle games, work very well on the challenge dimension and the strategy dimension of players. So if you're playing a puzzle, you're getting your challenge, there's strategic thinking in solving the different bits. But where we can create more value and give players new things is bring in a little bit of story and immersion, or give them a little bit of design and a little bit of narrative in the game. And we do see in the market that the games that go towards this way manage to capture new audiences and create new value and rise in the charts. Questions about solutions or frameworks to generate the solutions or value propositions? Yes?
How did you generate the range that you had on that previous diagram?
This one?
Yeah.
So for this one, we've used a qualitative survey. There was a questionnaire built around motivational framework. We've had it circulated amongst different players in the US, which is the most representative market for us at least. And then we've used some post-processing algorithms to create those audience profiles based on the genres. And we ask players what they like in games in general, mobile games in general, and what value they're getting out of their favorite games that they're playing. Yes?
Can you add weighting to this graph?
Weight?
Like weight? So for example, people think fantasy is more important than story, but in the graph it shows equally. How do you?
So that's actually a very good question. So that's the way we've done it. We've asked people to rank their top 3 things, both of the things they care about and the things that they are getting. And we've done it multiple times with different statements. We didn't just ask people, do you want more story? We had different statements to create this. So this is an average of overall, right? Because I'm not looking at one person. And ranking is good, but if I tell you the top 3 things that are important to me are my family, my friends, and my PlayStation, obviously the gap between 1 and 2 isn't the same as 2 and 3. But when we do it over a large audience sample, then it kind of balances out. Yes?
It seems like this metric would be amazing for any company with near unlimited resource and data. What if you're coming from an angle of you don't have all of this quantitative and qualitative data? Would you use personas, jobs to be done? What would you use with less information?
So I think personas are a good tool to think about who your customer is, what they want. Specifically in the context of gaming, I find personas, traditional personas that look at gender and age to be less relevant. To me, it doesn't matter if you're a 23-year-old guy or a 45-year-old woman in terms of what games you want to play and what you want to do. So this is, to me, the equivalent of persona in this context. But personas and thinking who your customer is a great tool. Because often what product managers do and mistake in doing is to think that they are the customer. They put themselves in the customer's shoes and think that what seems obvious to them seems obvious to the customer, and their needs are the customer's needs. And stepping back a bit and looking at it from a different direction goes a long way towards helping you understand. But even if you don't have unlimited resources, you could always open a survey on Facebook, on LinkedIn, spread it with your friends and family, and get a little bit of feedback, right?
Does King use jobs to be done at all?
Well, some teams do. I think when it comes to product management or product design, there are so many frameworks, and different frameworks have different values. In the sense of the job to be done, it's similar to what you want to achieve, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, about hypothesis-driven development, which is similar to jobs to be done, right? It's what we aim to achieve and how we're going to get there. But there is no one truth. There is no one right answer as to how to do things. Sure.
Hi. Shouldn't you define customers at the previous stage with the needs? Because when you identify needs, then more or less you know who your customer is and what they are looking for.
So that largely depends, right? So sometimes you start by looking for, sometimes you'd start by having a solution. So let's say you developed a new technology and you want to apply to different things. So how many of you use contactless when you pay for things? Right? I use it. I think it's so easy. But it started out when people built it, it was used to transfer contacts between 2 phones, which was so not very useful, right? So the technology was there, and sometimes you have the technology first, and then you need to find the need to apply it to. Sometimes it works the other way. Often when you're developing a new feature, you need to think about different needs that it would meet. So you shouldn't get tunnel vision. Even if you're developing a product for a specific need, you need to broaden your thinking and think about which other needs might it answer. Does this make sense? Any more questions? Yes?
At this stage, do you also engage with the developers? Do you also ask for their opinion? Or?
So that's a great question. I think you'd need the developers to get a sense of how feasible that is. I think a good product manager would have a bit of knowledge about development and what tools are possible, what can be done with the resources you have or not. Usually, I think it's better to involve more members of a team, because if you're striving to have as many ideas as possible, you should have as many people ideating as possible. Yes?
So how do you validate that you've kind of achieved that once you've made the product? So you say you're going to make a game that's high in discovery. How do you release that game and then validate that you've achieved that?
So that's a great question. And do you know what the difference between a good question and a great question is? So a great question is because now I'm going to talk about validation. So once you thought about your super mega billion-dollar idea, you need to actually validate it. And usually we think this is what validation is going to look like. We have our solution. We know it's great. We just need to get to check the box and see that it works. But more often than not, it looks like this. You test your ideas and you figure out you've done something wrong, which is great because this is what learnings are for. So when we try to learn and validate, I personally like to use a hypothesis-driven approach, which means we start with a statement. We believe that the feature or product will result in an outcome. And we know it's a success when we see this test result or this metric change. And it's really important to define those things before you actually do the test. So one reason is you don't have to argue with people afterwards whether it was a success or not. You can get all the stakeholders to align and decide what's a good idea and what works. The second reason is that using an hypothesis-driven approach is more scientific. And if you've done any science-related studies, you know that you can never prove an hypothesis. You can only fail to disprove it. And this is the sort of thinking you want. You want to avoid tunnel vision. So once you got all your hypotheses, you prioritize them. And you do that by certainty and importance. So let's say I'm pitching to you a new e-commerce website or platform, right? So a big question would be, would people be interested in buying things online? And today it seems like, of course. But imagine when Amazon started, that was a really big question because there were barriers about trusting payments online. There were barriers in regards to how could we make sure that the quality works. And this is also a very important question. So obviously you want to test the most important questions first and the ones you're least certain about. And when you're testing things, it's always good to use a minimum viable product to do it in the leanest fashion possible with as few resources possible. And the reason you have a computer and a computer mouse here is because this is my favorite story about lean testing. I don't know if it's actually true, but I like it so much I'm going to share it with you. So the story is that when people set out to test the first computer mouse, instead of building all the hardware and all the software and all the connections, they just had like a small cardboard box that somebody moved, different users, and somebody else would move the cursor on the screen. And they would check if it's intuitive. And that's a super important question. When you're building a computer mouse, do people even like it? Does this make sense before you build the entire hardware and software? So I encourage you, when you're testing your features, when you're testing your products, when you're building something new, try and think about the easiest way to build it. So I'm assuming most of you aren't multi-million-dollar companies and you don't have a strong financial backing to test the ideas. And even if you do, you want to do it in a lean way and try to prove it in a lean way. So we've done the validation. Now you get a bunch of learning. And learning, to me, is the most important part. When we're doing experiments at King, often we learn things we didn't even know. And learning doesn't necessarily mean a success. Sometimes you learn a lot from failure. And this is, again, why it's important to have a hypothesis-driven approach. You don't want to try and prove that you are right, because as a past management consultant, I can tell you that you can take any series of numbers and get it to say anything you want it to say, if you really want it. But when you're trying to see if your assumptions are robust, if your hypotheses are robust, you're forced to try and see, are you failing? Does this make sense? And sometimes along the way, you learn that what you've created works for something else much better. And then you can pivot and you can take your product and get it into a new product. So often I get asked, how many times should you iterate? How many times should you create the learning. And there is no right answer. It's not 5 times and it's not 500 million times. It's as many times as it takes. And again, it's going back to the hypothesis definition and to what success looks like, what good looks like. And in that sense, you know you can stop testing either when you've learned something significant and now you're pivoting, or when the increments of your learning, the improvements get smaller and smaller and smaller. So at this point, it would be more efficient to move on and to develop the rest of the product. How do you learn? So I'm a strong believer in A/B tests. When you're creating a new feature, never test it on its own. Always use a control group so you can have a relative uplift, so you can avoid different biases in the testing. Quantitative analysis based on data you may have in your companies are great. For those of you that come from a data analysis background, I think data always speaks loud. When you have actual numbers to back up what you're thinking, it always works better than having your opinion. Qualitative data is just as important. I've never once met somebody who regretted attending a user testing. There's always something to learn, talking with new people, getting a fresh view. And user testing can be done either by way of a focus group, one-on-one interviews, or just having some people hang out in your office and use your products occasionally. So, an important thing to say about hypothesis testing is you never get an answer. You can only get signals, and signals are weaker or stronger indications that you are right. And the other things you're getting is learning. It's everything you learned along the way, whether it was what you intended to or not. And then you reach this phase, which the implementation. And that's something I'm not going to talk about. Implementation is once you have had your hypothesis, now you know what you aim to achieve. You should have a spec. Then you go into all the Scrum, the Kanban, working with the team, defining everything. And of course, this is an iterative process. So even when you start and you start learning about the product and you start iterating, it's never done. You've created a feature, there's always a new feature to create. You can always learn more, you can always build more, or you can pivot altogether. So before I get to my last slide, any questions about validation? Yes?
So King operates on many different markets, and it's one of the biggest mobile games in the world. How do you deal with the validation when the solution is different for the different markets?
Well, I think when we A/B test our ideas, we try to segment the solution. So we wouldn't look just at the impact in one country or on one user segment. We'd look at the impact on all of our players, different categories, and we also make sure to look over time. We always make sure to A/B test because we aspire to be a very data-driven and data-informed company. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, how would you set the team up to execute across all of that? Would you have one team looking at optimal solution, another team doing validation, or are you set up in pods and iterate through the cycle?
So I don't think there is one correct answer as to how you structure your team. I think it largely depends on what type of products you're building, what your organization looks like. I think what's important is the mentality of the team. And the mentality of the team should be that everybody can question everything. Everybody, of course, respectfully, but everybody can raise questions. Everybody should question the norm, and everybody's voices should be heard. And you need to set up the team in such a way that there's no one person that sits in the back and never talks, but they might have the best ideas and they just don't want to go out against the norm. I think, if you look at innovation, innovation always comes by questioning the norm. Otherwise, you'll just do what everybody else is doing. And that's the important mentality of a team. Yes.
So as a PM, how do you split the time among 4 tasks?
That's a big question. So it really differs on the part in the product lifecycle. So when you're looking at a product that's under prototyping, you'd spend most of your time thinking, what is the opportunity, changing the prototype, which at this point is very flexible to generate the different opportunities, to answer the different needs, and to come up with different solutions. When you're testing the product, you'd spend most of your time here around solution and validation, iterating. Sometimes you'd have to reset, go back to the opportunity. With live games or live products, I'd say you'd spend less time around opportunities and more about solutions and validations, because you already know what value you're delivering. But you should always keep your eyes open because the markets change, the solutions change. And, you know, sometimes you'd have the same questions as you had yesterday, but the answers would be different. Yes?
How do you define the metric of success?
Well, again, as with many things, it depends. It depends what product you're testing. So if I'm building a feature that aims to get to increase engagement, I might define retention or active days in a month. If I'm trying to create a better user interface, so I might check how many people drop at different points along the way of the user journey, right? But the important thing is you think about what you aim to achieve and define success based on that. Then think what KPI or what metric you could use to measure that goal. Yes?
How would you do A/B testing in a startup with very limited resources?
So it depends how many people you have using your product, right? To have A/B test in terms of data, usually you'd want to have a certain amount of people in each group to make sure you have significance. But I'll talk about minimum viable product again. Just have different things out there and then get signals. So the signals might not be as strong, but you'd get a direction and you slowly narrow down. And I think people who have a startup and truly believe in their idea, you know, you can always bootstrap and find different friends, different people who would use this product. You can find different ways to incentivize people to do it, right? So you don't have to have the strongest confidence. You just have to have a lot of willpower and a lot of willingness to go out there and get people to try it out. And sometimes you can't A/B test. Yes?
I was going to ask, on the validation step, say if you run a test to find your product market fit, and you find out actually it doesn't actually have a very strong product market fit, but the business owner may want to press ahead with the growth and scale, how do you deal with that sort of disjointedness between that the product that doesn't have a market fit, but then the business wants to release it across everywhere?
So sometimes the business would have different reasons. Sometimes they would just want to get their foot in the door into a given market and get something out there to generate more learnings, or, you know, just to be present and have some grounds before they launch their next product. So sometimes there are different reasons. Let's assume that you do want to get a good product market fit. Then at this point, it's about the organizational culture. So I think people at a good organization should be able to feel that they can speak up, and should be able to tell the product owner this doesn't work. But you shouldn't just say that. You should have some data to back you up that comes from the different hypotheses and the different learnings you have, and say, I don't think this is going to work because of A, B, C, and this creates a discussion. So what can we do to make it work? What in our product works well? What doesn't work well? Maybe we're not looking at the right market. Maybe we have a great product, but it just fits elsewhere. Right. More questions? Yes?
So kind of on the back of the previous question, what's your decision-making process? I mean, like whether you are taking the decisions with the team collectively, eventually yourself, listening to everyone but taking the decision yourself, or you always kind of get approval from business or someone who gives you money?
Again, I think it depends on the organization. For me personally, at the experimentation team, we get a lot of autonomy to test things and to look at things, and then we pitch the ideas. But you know, there's always stakeholders that need to decide, even if this is a good idea, is this the best idea? Because often the biggest cost organizations have is the opportunity cost. So if we do a $1 million idea, $1 million idea, maybe we're missing out on a $1 billion idea. Does this make sense?
Just to dig a bit deeper into that, then how do you, in terms of roadmap, say, you know, short-term games and products, you know, what percentage of time are you spending validating ideas around that, and at the same time looking at strategic opportunities in the product that might be like 3, 6, maybe years time? How do you balance that?
So I think a good product team would always have like a balanced backlog. So they would have things that improve current features. They would get a lot of feedback from users, whether through data or otherwise, and strive to improve their product based on that. At the same time, the team should also look for new opportunities and be proactive in looking at the market and generating more ideas for the backlog. And as with most backlog prioritization, you should think about what is the estimated impact and what is the estimated effort, and then it's an exercise of what should we do first.
Sorry, just one more question on that. Say definitely looking at building features that are more focused in on, okay, this is going to drive more, let's say subscription revenue, for example, it's going to be more of a business function, versus those that are going to be more along with the customer experience. Do you have like an internal kind of style guide, so to speak, or set of rules of the road that you use to make decisions on, what matters most at a particular time? Is it always customer first and then business second? I mean, how would you allocate your resources to focus on?
Well, I like to think that if you put the customer first, everything follows. Because over time, in the long term, if you do decisions that have short-term benefits for the business but hurt the customers, then you're just going to lose their customers. There's always competition, and they could always find more value elsewhere. So you need to put the customer, in my opinion, the customer first in the vision. Obviously, sometimes you need to have short-term decisions that customers might not like, because it's a business after all. So if you look at games, we have to have monetization in them, because we are a business after all. I think often when you have a bigger organization, it's not just looking at one product, but looking at your portfolio in general. And then you go into the very complicated realm of portfolio strategy, and sometimes you need to let one product cannibalize another, but you need to make decisions that would help grow the business long term. I think a good business would have a vision of what they aim to achieve, and then this is like your compass, this is your North Star, and all the decisions you make are aimed towards there. Right, so before I finish, I'll let you have some more time for questions, but I want to tell you a story that to me encompasses all of those things together. And I want to talk about a company called YouTube. So long before Tinder made swiping a thing that everybody who's matchmaking are doing, there was a company called YouTube that wanted to bring dating to the internet. And back in the 80s and the 90s, people had this weird thing that you'd send videotapes of yourself and get videotapes of other people. And what YouTube did said, well, how about we do it online so people can upload videos of themselves and find other people that would match what we want. And they really worked on that product. So they've improved all the features of uploading the videos, of content discovery. And they were focused not just on improving the features, but on the learnings around them. And part of what they learned is that people aren't just interested in uploading videos of themselves talking about what they like to do and who they'd like to date, but uploading just silly things they're doing, uploading creative things that they're doing, and upload just everything. And this is how YouTube was born. And I don't think like an online video dating website has as much potential as YouTube does. But the important thing is not to have tunnel vision, is always to keep your eyes open, look at the technology you have. Does your solution enable different needs? And I encourage you to, when you're creating your product, always try and think creatively, always be ready to pivot, and always create something new. Thank you.